Hello and welcome to the No Fear podcast. Today's guest is Harry Reid, former lead instrumentation engineer at Virgin Orbit and soon-to-be engineer at Rocket Lab. Our conversation covers everything from space exploration to satellite technologies and much, much more. This episode was one of my favorites, and I'm sure you'll love it.
Welcome to the No Fear podcast with your hosts, Noah and Ophir, where we sit down to discuss the journeys of accomplished young professionals who have taken action towards manifesting a career and a life that go far beyond the ordinary. Each week, we bring to you a young professional currently achieving success in entrepreneurship, STEM or other forward-thinking, innovative sectors. Please enjoy today's episode of the No Fear podcast, brought to you by House & Hughes, shophouseandhughes.com. The perfect destination for thousands of curated wall art designs.
Harry, how's it going? Super excited to have you here today.
Hey, Noah, Ophir, happy to be here.
Awesome. Yeah, no, Harry and I, we actually got to meet up in Long Beach. I was out there for business and got to catch up a little bit to University of Florida engineering grads and got to learn a little bit about his background, his career, and thought it would be an exciting conversation to continue here. So first of all, Harry, thank you for coming on. And why don't you start off and tell us a little bit about where you currently are in your career in this jump between the two different companies?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me. So I've been working in the aerospace industry for about 4 years, working for a small launch provider company called Virgin Orbit. I mainly was working as an electrical instrumentation engineer, even though my background isn't in that. And then a couple weeks ago, going through a change now, I decided to kind of look to keep expanding my skills and knowledge. So put in my 2 weeks after a grueling interview process, accepted a new offer at Rocket Lab, which I'll be starting in a couple weeks, doing something a little bit different. So, lots of movement. First time making a jump like that since at the beginning of my career, but excited about the future and what's coming.
If you can break down for our viewers, what exactly is an instrumentation engineer?
Totally. So when you think of any sort of technical company, let's leave it that broad, right? But I guess specifically with the focus of rockets and launch companies too, you need data, right? If you're monitoring a process or you are making engineering decisions, you need to have data so you can make an informed decision. And also on the flip side of that, you need to have data so that you can kind of have automated control processes, especially in complicated systems like a rocket, where a lot of it is autonomous. So what an instrumentation engineer does is they're essentially the person who's responsible for all of the interconnects between your sensors and your data system. So think a lot of wiring, electrical schematics, choosing sensors, understanding how the data system works, how you're going to interpret the data. That's kind of what an instrumentation engineer does. You can kind of think of it as like a data engineer, but more hardware focused and less software focused generally. So that's what I've been doing.
Sounds very complicated, but very cool. The data that you're collecting, is that generally to conduct research, or is it more for maintaining the integrity of the rocket to make sure certain pressures are what they're supposed to be, or some measures are what they're supposed to be?
Yeah, good question. Most cases, the answer would be the latter. You're going to be having data that's coming back to, either a computer, so the computer can make a decision to open a valve, for example, to relieve pressure in a system, or it'll come back to an operator, somebody who's sitting at a computer looking at the data, and who can then make another decision based off that. But on the flip side, sometimes you'll say, hey, we're going to do this really cool test right now, and I want to see this specific data in this area and what that might look like. And so in that case, maybe you'll just set something up for research, so it can kind of be both things. That's kind of the cool thing about it, is a lot of it can kind of be like fly on the edge of your seat. Like, hey, let's figure out how we're going to make this work.
That's awesome, man. So when you're focused on these types of projects, what are the typical goals of these launches?
So at Virgin, we make a rocket that launches off the wing of a 747 jumbo jet. And what we do is we install customers' small sats, so think CubeSats, into the fairing of a rocket and then deliver them to orbit. That's what our job is, and that's what we do. So we go through this whole process of building the rocket, testing everything. The only thing that matters is getting these satellites to orbit.
What is that cycle of, coming up with the idea, the goal of the mission, and then planning out the launch, and then the actual launch and post-launch look like?
Good question. So it is a really long process, and a lot of times these missions are planned maybe even a year in advance, right? We'll leave that to kind of the business development team at all these small rocket companies. So at Rocket Lab 2, they do the same thing as well, generally. Every company has their own processes for how you build up a site and how you take it down. Some companies can have more of a permanent launch infrastructure. So you'll have a vertical launch pad, and all of your commodities will always be there, and your systems will be hooked up. You put a new rocket on, you hook it up. Virgin is a little bit more modular. We launch from different locations, so there's a lot more to it. You have to bring everything to the launch site. This is what we just went through for our recent mission in United Kingdom, which I think we'll talk about, I'm sure, at some point in a little bit more detail. So the thing is, this is a quote that you'll hear all the time if you're in the aerospace industry. Space is hard. And
it is rocket science.
It's hard, man. That's why, you see failures all the time with these new companies that are starting up. The challenges to try and get something to orbit are immense.
So if I understand this right, you guys send up satellites, to put it in layman's terms. What are these satellites generally for? Certain governments, or what types of companies?
Yeah. So one of the cool things is that the applications are huge for small sats and just satellites in general. You could have communications, intelligence, science, right? Weather observation. So these are all different possibilities of what satellites can go into a fairing. And the only limiting factor is, can it fit, or can your rocket take it to space? It doesn't have the payload capacity. So at Virgin, for example, we have a mix of customers. It can be, actual governments, like the Polish government, the UK government was one of our recent customers. But also we've had private companies that want to send a small sat to space to expand their communications array, for example. Well, one of the cool things about these small launch provider companies, and it's very different from SpaceX, which is a huge rocket that can take, huge amounts of mass to orbit. When you think of these smaller companies, they can take a fraction of it, maybe a 20th or less. So they're not being used to send huge constellations or massive satellites to orbit. But what they are doing is, let's say you have a constellation of satellites, right? And you need 100% coverage. One of them goes out. What do? Do you pay for a spot on a huge launch provider and maybe have to burn a lot of your mass to get to your orbit? Or maybe you can use a smaller company like Virgin or Rocket Lab or all the other emerging companies too, Relativity, Astra, ABL. There's so many of them now. And they can bring you to your target orbit, and maybe maybe it will end up being cheaper too. So maybe, usually not though.
So as you start describing a number of these different companies that work in this market, right? How does the market actually look? Is there a marketplace where the commercial applications and the government applications will go to find space on a certain rocket based on the payload, or how does that actually work?
Yeah, so I think a lot of it is kind of closed door discussions between like the business development teams and external customers. So I don't really have a huge window in there in terms of how customers originally approach a company. I don't have a ton of insight in that regard.
In general, how much information are the engineers privy to? Is there ever like a satellite that goes up where you don't have full intelligence of what it's for, or do you genuinely all know?
That is a good question. I think that you're onto something there. We might have like a top secret like government payload, and we won't know anything about what it does. We'll be able to see like if we can get it there, but you're right. Maybe we're sending something up to spy on us, like listen over our conversations.
In the back rooms, do the engineers ever have like theories of what this might be, or kind of like little bets going on the side?
For the most part, I think it's relatively clear what we're sending up. Usually, most of them are of science. Most of it is science related, weather observation, that sort of thing. But
Like a Chinese weather balloon?
Chinese weather balloons, exactly. No, but definitely some speculation there too. Trying to figure out like, hey, what is this thing?
So where did your initial interest in the space industry start?
I feel like I kind of fell into it. A lot of people who are in this industry, like when they were 3 years old, decided they want to be an astronaut and then have followed that ever since. For me, I didn't know what I wanted to do. I wanted to be a musician. I wanted to be a swimmer. I wanted to do so much different stuff. And then I think in high school, I just realized like, hey, I really like math and science. And I think I'm good at this. And my teacher was like, hey, why don't you look into engineering? So I did, went to school, started as a mechanical engineer, which is the broadest degree that you could have because I didn't know what I wanted to do. And then I was like, I've always had an interest in space. So I think that when it came time for me to like start looking for internships, that was kind of the original, some stuff that I was looking into. And then once I got my first internship, I was like, this is freaking awesome. Kind of develop this plan to like have a focus in aerospace. And then the rest is kind of history.
So you've given us a very broad concept of how Virgin Orbit operates. What is the day-to-day operations that you're actually involved in?
I was a member of the launch operations team. So my job was actually not really rocket focused. It was mainly actually on the ground support equipment that is used to provide the rocket with all of the commodities that it needs in order to launch. But on the flip side, I also worked as a console operator too, as that's also one of the duties of kind of the launch ops group. So to kind of give you a better answer on like what a window into like what my day-to-day might have been like, right? We'll say, okay, launch campaign is coming up. We're launching in a month and a half. Let's bring all our hardware to the site, set it up, conduct all of our procedures to go through all of our leak checks, data system checks, mount the rocket onto the plane, and kind of assist with all of these operations up until the day of launch. Going through a wet dress rehearsal, which is what you call it when you fully load the vehicle, kind of like as a practice run, kind of make sure there's no leaks. You give it a cryogenic fill. At cryo temps, a lot of times you'll see leaks that might not be present at lower temperatures or higher temperatures, sorry. So you kind of go through all those things, and then once you're ready, go into the control room to your assigned operator console position. For me, it was a ground systems engineer, and help load the thing and get it out of here. So that's kind of like what my day-to-day looked like. But there's so many different side things. They're like, hey, can we improve this or fix this? This thing just broke. What do we do with this? A lot of really cool technical problems that you run into on kind of a daily basis, which makes it fun.
So day of launch, you sit in, what do you call that? Like mission control center
Exactly.
or something?
Yeah,
What's that experience like, seeing, an effect that you have on a rocket that's then launched into the atmosphere?
It's intense. There's a lot of pressure in the room. It's kind of palpable. Everyone can feel it, but there's also a lot of excitement. And I think that there's a lot of faith too. Like, hey, we've done this a bunch of times at this point. We've tested the crap out of this rocket. We feel good about this. Let's just go through these things. We're at the last checkpoint of what we've been doing for months now, right? Because maybe from the launch operations team, the way that works for us is we basically get a fully built rocket, right? But think about the rest of the company that this rocket has been in the process of being built for months now, right? So much work has led up to this point, and now it's just like, okay, I think everyone feels pretty confident. It feels good, and like, let's just blow this thing. Well, I guess that's the wrong way to put it. Let's launch this thing.
What's so cool about that is if you consider like most jobs, there's not really a build up towards something so spectacular. Maybe like going to battle or something like that, where you'd lose sleep over what's coming the next day. But that's something so unique about your job, right? It's not something that's the general case. I mean, what I do, I never have anything that exciting. You know what I mean? Like, that's an awesome thing.
Yep. I think the closest thing is maybe in a deal you might be working on when you have that final meeting, but I can't really imagine it really having that same emotional buildup that a launch would. But what does the team do for celebration after a successful launch?
Besides just clapping, I would imagine.
Yeah, I think that everyone's so excited. I've been at Virgin since our first mission 4 years ago, and I think we've had a total of uh, 4 or 5 successful launches and a couple failures. Our most recent one out of the UK that I was kind of just brushing up on. Unfortunately, that mission ended in a failure. But for the successes, it's a blast. Like there's kind of two different things that we've done, right? So one, on the launch team, we work really closely with all of our like launch technicians, who are the people who are in the field, opening, closing valves, attaching, disconnecting hoses, right? It's the most dangerous job in the company, and they're called the Red Crew, and that's also a term that's used across the industry for the crew of technicians that is kind of like the final stand, right? The people who are approaching the rocket when it's fully loaded to do disconnects and things like that. So, what the Red Crew does what the technicians do after a launch that I've had some fun is when we launch out of Mojave, we'll drive out to the desert, go camping, just have a bonfire, kind of get up to a whole bunch of shenanigans as you could expect. But then there's also the kind of more tame company celebration. We'll all go out to a brewery together. The CEO will give a nice speech, that kind of thing. But, between us, technician celebration is more fun.
Very cool. Very cool. So you've mentioned some failures. What's the biggest failure that you've run into in like a high pressure situation, and how has that reaction been?
The answer is our most recent mission. Launch 2 is what we called our like first real launch attempt. The first one was kind of filled with water and it was just a practice run. The first real launch attempt, like everyone was really optimistic and hopeful, but I think the expectations were kind of low at the same time. So like when the first launch attempt ended in a failure ever, it was like, okay, like we got some good data, we're figuring it out. We can still recover from this and we'll be fine. The most recent mission, this was a huge moment for Virgin because they were proving out their business case as like, hey, we're a company that can go overseas to your country and launch a rocket from your soil to bring your satellites to space. Like this is what we can do. And this was the first time that we would have done that. And it ended in a failure. And it was excruciating. Like we were there. I was living in Europe for like 2 months before this mission, trying to, to help as much as I can to get this thing off. And it was kind of crushing. And I think that the message from the company is very optimistic and positive for how we're going to bounce back from this. So there's definitely a lot of optimism and hope there. So like, I think the most important thing is just that a good message is being conveyed and you have faith in your leadership and the company. Like, okay, this is not it. Like we're fine. Obviously I did decide to leave the company. The reason wasn't like directly because of the failure of that mission. That was something I had already been planning and thinking about before. But kind of coming back from that, everyone took some time to really just take a step back and think about things and figure out what exactly happened so we can make it better and so it doesn't happen again. That's the most important thing. It's like when you fail, right? Figure out how to prevent it from happening again the same way.
So you had briefly mentioned early in the conversation that Poland was another country you guys were working on, or rather with. What was that project like?
From our standpoint, like it's like the engineers working at the company, our interaction with the foreign governments and their payloads is actually kind of limited. We have a payload-specific team that will work with them to kind of check out all their hardware and then install it into the rocket. But besides that, like it's just another day at the office for us. It's another satellite. We don't really know or care essentially what it does as long as it fits in our payload and we can, as long as it fits in our payload fairing and we can, meets all of our requirements. So I think that the interaction with these foreign entities and with this huge variety of customers is awesome. And I'd love to do something that's a little more customer facing and be involved with those kind of discussions.
Now that you've described your role at Virgin Orbit, how is your role changing as you move to Rocket Lab, a new business?
One of the most important things for me is that I'm always trying to kind of learn something new and expand my skills. And this is something that everybody should, in my opinion, everyone should have the same mindset, right? The primary reason why I left VO is because I want to continue learning and try something new. So at Rocket Lab, I'm not going to be working as an instrumentation engineer. And instead, what I'm doing is more of like an integration and test and systems engineering type position. So it's going to be kind of higher level. Going to be one thing that I'm going to be working on is a lot of the electrical system design decisions for their new satellite bus that they're making, which is really exciting to me. And then I'll also be working on kind of validating and verifying all the hardware for those satellites before we put them into a rocket. So it's going to be new. I've never worked on satellites before, so it's kind of like a different side of the same industry, same business. And I think that the technology and science there is so exciting. Can't wait to learn more.
That's awesome. Talking about some of the different technology in this industry, offline, you had mentioned to me a couple new types of launch styles. I think there was one company that was doing some type of like a gyration or something. Could you talk to us a little bit about that and what that looks like?
Yeah. So one awesome company in the area that you're referring to is called Spin Launch. And I think that amongst a lot of engineers in the industry and different aerospace companies, there's kind of like a mysticism and like question, like, how the hell are you going to do this? But basically what they do is they have a giant centrifuge and they take a satellite that's basically only a second stage. So normally when you have a rocket, you have two stages to reach orbit. Your first stage, which is the bulk of your mass and the bulk of your propellant. And then once you reach a certain altitude, you have a stage separation, and then a second engine that turns on with a lot less weight that can take you to your final destination. What Spin Launch does is they eliminated the need for a first stage, and what they do is they have a centrifuge that spins at insane RPMs, and basically it'll spin up super, 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 super fast, and then a little tiny like window will open in the chamber. The rocket will disconnect from the centrifuge and shoot out. And basically shoot out so fast that you can get to a high altitude with and high enough where theoretically just a second stage can take you to orbit. It's actually such an awesome idea. And there's so much cool promise and potential for this technology, especially when I think of like, maybe putting this sort of thing on the moon or, on other things that maybe require less activation energy to kind of get out. But the reason why it's so hard is because when you're spinning something in a centrifuge that fast, you pull so many Gs and you have so much acceleration that your payload can't survive that. So right now, the technology doesn't exist to have a payload that can survive that sort of acceleration. Just imagine. I forget how fast it is. I want to say it's thousands of RPM, So it's a really cool idea, but it's kind of like, at least in my opinion, it seems like sort of like a, pun intended, a moonshot. Like, I don't know how. I guess I'll believe it when I see it.
That's funny. No, that's so cool. And when Harry and I were riding around the kind of the Long Beach area, it was almost like the Hollywood of space right there. Like there was this company to the left, this company to the right. What are the interactions between these companies? Do they bounce things off each other? Are there relationships in between the companies, or are they very competitive and standoffish? Or what is the community of space like?
Yeah. So I think that generally, like person to person, people are friendly, but there's definitely no sort of communication or collaboration like across the companies. Everyone's in it for themselves. It's a super competitive, highly saturated industry, the small rocket industry. And all of these companies are fighting for it. And every week you hear about a new company that's emerging into the space trying to do the same thing. So everyone has their own proprietary technology or their own like business advantage and competitive edge, and they're trying to retain that. So, like you said, in this area, just in this 3-block radius next to Virgin Orbit, you have Rocket Lab, you got Spin Launch. A mile down the street, you got Relativity Space, and then go a little bit further up to Hawthorne, you got SpaceX, who's in a league of their own. But yeah, it's exciting that there is a lot of competition because it means that there's a lot of money there and a lot of room for people who are growing, especially in their early careers. But what that also means that there's a lot of competition is that there's also going to be a lot of companies that don't make it.
Absolutely. So with this being kind of a closely knit, but not relationship wise, but just a geographically close community, are there any names or people in the industry that you really look up to as kind of a model for success in the industry?
Great question. I think that when you're in your early career, everybody kind of, you meet these people that have really big impacts on you, and like will have lasting impressions. So I have personal figures like that, kind of mentors that I've been working with over the years. But other than that, you can kind of appreciate people who have like, these larger than life CEOs, right? Like you got Elon Musk, you got for Virgin, it's Dan Hart, Tim Ellis for Relativity, Peter Beck for Rocket Lab. All these people have like such grand visions, and a lot of times they can be really inflammatory. Like just look at Elon, for example. These are people I guess you can look up to, but in a way also like take what they say with a grain of salt, because a lot of I think with a lot of them, they get maybe a little dissociated from reality. I guess I'm only talking about Elon Musk, but he's like it's kind of weird because I love the guy and he is amazing, and everything that SpaceX is doing is like they're pushing the industry more than anyone else you've ever seen. But at the same time, like there's the other side of the coin where there's a lot of weird comments and a lot of things that maybe might tick some people off or rub some people the wrong way. So in terms of having like other people or specific figures that I look up to, one person that I think is does the right things is Richard Branson. Like I think that he's the guy who he is somebody who cares a lot about people, and I think that that's the right mentality. Like people push so hard to push their companies and send stuff to space, but ultimately, like the people who really matter are the employees and the people, and you got to retain them, and you have to care.
So you mentioned Elon Musk. He's often had a feud in the media with Jeff Bezos. How is Blue Origin's role in this market?
So Blue is interesting because they have so much money and so much funding, and they're always hiring like crazy. I have a bunch of friends who've gone over to Blue to work in Washington or LA, because now they're opening new locations everywhere. Blue Origin is really poised for to be a huge player in this business. They have a ton of money and have, obviously with Jeff Bezos, they kind of have like an unlimited well to just do what they need to do. And that's usually the limiting factor with all these companies. But it's weird because like we've heard about Blue Origin for so many years now. And obviously they have New Glenn, which I think is their, hopefully I didn't get that backwards. They have New Glenn and New Shepard, but one of them is their, manned like space tourism, that's space tourism business. And then the other one is the actual satellite launch provider business. So I think they've already done a successful, space tourism thing. So hopefully they can keep doing that. I think the more, even though I think it's silly, I think that the more people that can do this and the more publicity there is around space, the better. But what really matters is like keep developing this launch technology, right? And I think Blue has a lot of potential. They haven't had a successful launch yet or brought any satellites to space, but hopefully it's coming soon. I think hopefully everyone roots for each other is what I'm thinking. I'm rooting for them at least.
You've mentioned now a number of private companies that are innovating. They're raising a lot of capital. A lot are seeing success. How is NASA's imprint in the space industry today? Is NASA still innovating? Is NASA still that shining beacon of like space exploration that it was 50, 60 years ago?
So it's a hugely different approach from what it was 50, 60 years ago, right? 50, 60 years ago, NASA was the company that was developing Saturn V and developing these huge rockets, right? Now that mantle has passed to the private industry for the most part. You still have SLS, right? The Space Launch System. But in general, what NASA does now is a lot of their funding goes towards funding these private companies and giving them contracts so that they can in turn build up their technology and their industry. So it's kind of, and what NASA does now is they're just focusing on basically space technology. And by that, like they're building satellites and they are analyzing, like the geology of Mars and like life applications, on other planets and that sort of things. And that is where they should be focused, because like they don't need to be worrying about building launch vehicles anymore. Right? Us as the taxpayers who are funding this, like we've got all these new private companies that can do this. So I think that the transition is kind of in the right direction. But NASA's imprint and role is still massive, because a huge amount of the funding that's keeping these private industries going, it's all coming from NASA's budget.
Harry, you really have an awesome understanding of like the innovation within the industry, the connectivity within the industry, and really how it all circles back to one another. What do you think is the biggest problem? Like, could it be, space debris, or an over population of satellites, or an ease of spying, or what do you think is the number one issue in the kind of the development of space technology?
Yeah, great question. I think that so I don't know if I would say it's the number one issue. You touched on a couple of really cool ones, by the way. But one thing that in space that like we'll need to surpass is the limitations of our current like propulsion technology, right? Like we can only accelerate so much, and our fuel is only so efficient. So like we can get around our solar system, but like we're never going to be able to leave the solar system or go elsewhere unless we really have breakthroughs in propulsion technology, so we can go faster and for longer. So that's kind of one really cool one that I think is really interesting to me, and that I don't have any role in furthering, but it's cool following from the sidelines. And there is really cool new technology that's coming out, electric propulsion, things like that. But one cool one that I'll touch on too is orbital debris that you mentioned. There's been some good like forward progress in this field. Like now, anytime you send something to space, you have to have a plan for deorbiting it essentially, or pushing it to like a non-congested orbit, because you have these like crazy cataclysmic events that can happen, right? Like 15, 20 years ago, you have this huge satellite that breaks up and increases the amount of orbital debris in the in our orbit by, I forget the number, but an exorbitant amount, like a factor of 2 or something like that, maybe even more. So being able to prevent those sort of things and have mitigation tactics to reduce that is really important, because it's only going to make things harder for going to space. And especially when you incorporate the human element into the mix, like it's really dangerous. You can have something the size of a penny that can have catastrophic impacts to your spacecraft. So you need to be able to defend against that sort of thing. And like we have really good tracking capabilities. Like we can monitor things that are so small from Earth using radar and technologies like that, which is really cool. But it is something to keep an eye on. I think right now we're still okay. Like we're not at a point where space is going to be so congested and we can't launch anything anymore. And that's not coming anytime soon, unless you have one of these cataclysmic orbital debris events.
Didn't that occur several months ago when Russia blew up some satellite that caused damage to a number of U.S. satellites, something along those lines?
I think what happened, was it Russia or was it China, actually? Something
Maybe
like that.
It was China, one of the two.
Yeah. I think that they, like you said, they did a test where they, destroyed a satellite as part of a test. And the ISS, I think, had to do an emergency maneuver in order to avoid the International Space Station, ISS, had to do a maneuver to avoid that debris field, which is crazy. That's actually while I'm talking about this, one more comment, Noah. Space and space defense is something that's going to be more important, and you're going to see this issue become more and more crucial during our lifetimes. The ability to like take down satellites from Earth is going to have really huge implications. And like, you can knock out a country's intelligence gathering resources or things like that. And so you see a lot of companies whose like idea is like, okay, we can send up a satellite to replace that fast, and things like that. And that's one of Virgin Orbit's things. But that's another area where you're going to see, like this test that just happened that you just mentioned, Ophir, a couple months ago. You're going to keep seeing things like this. And this is a new threat and a new issue that like we've never really seen before. Like we never were able to do this sort of thing. So now humans have the ability to take satellites out. And that's another reality that we have to be prepared to deal with.
No, 100%. So I've actually been watching, maybe because of political tensions across the world right now, a lot of these like simulations of a nuclear war and how satellites play into the effect of one, like detecting an ICBM that's coming across, and I know there's like a couple different stages of the launch, and then before the end of it that has the nuclear shells releases and all that kind of stuff. What does the development of space defense with some of these satellites and maybe defending a nuclear attack look like within the industry?
I don't know if I have enough expertise to really comment on this. I think that, like you mentioned, surveillance is like one of the best things that we can have from satellites. So you can kind of pinpoint exactly. I think interconnected systems, right? So like you have your satellites that's talking to your ground system. That might be your missile defense system, and it can give you a precise coordinate or tracking location that can give you better data to take it out.
Real quick, do you think that AI and machine learning can like infinitely better the technology and detection throughout the space industry?
Oh yeah, 100%. You have companies like Palantir and like Anduril, whose business is, like, yes, they make specific military applications and tools, but also like part of their business, that's they're really the core of their business is like their software and their AI, and kind of developing this technology to address the same exact issues that you're talking about.
You've described a lot of the competition between the private companies as well. Are you seeing a lot of competition between, well, obviously we're seeing a ton of competition between the United States and China and Russia and their space capabilities. Who's leading that in your opinion currently?
Yeah, I actually don't really know much about what's going on outside the US in terms of space technology. I know that we're doing a lot, but I don't know what China is doing. And that's kind of scary, I guess.
Yeah, I guess that's a benefit to a closed society. The information doesn't come out like it does here.
Yeah. So good question. I don't know. And hopefully we don't, find out anytime soon if it's malicious.
I actually was reading, or rather listening to a podcast the other day about Ronald Reagan and his Star Wars, the Star Wars system that was built for the sake of taking out Soviet ICBMs. Is that system a reality today? Have you heard of it? Where basically space lasers would take out an ICBM as they come towards the United States. Where are we in that defense technology today, or even the reach of that technology today?
Man, I do not know. That sounds pretty insane. I know that. I don't know what the extent of the technology is. I know you have countries like Israel, for example, that have like excellent missile defense, and I would say countries like Israel are sort of leading the charge in a lot of ways when it comes to missile defense, because they have to. But I don't know the reality of that Death Star technology.
So Harry, you've talked about a lot of your impact on the day-to-day, a lot of the industry knowledge and connectivity, failures that you've overcome and successes that you've had. But where do you really find your true purpose within your day-to-day job, and what wakes you up in the morning in terms of your impact on the global delivery of space innovation?
A great question. For me, I think where I get the most meaning and gratitude out of my work is there's kind of two different sides to it. One is like interaction with my peers. One of the things that I really put a huge emphasis on is working closely with other people, lifting other people up, enabling others, and like learning from the people around you. And so like space is cool. I love space, but like I mentioned to you, like I didn't have that driving desire from being 3 years old, like to be in the space industry and run this language, excuse my language. But so like, I love the science. I love working in engineering. I love solving problems. Those are the things that I love. But it doesn't have to be necessarily like the space industry for me to be doing that. The things that I get the most meaning from is like, if I see a hard problem in front of me and people don't know how to figure out, like understanding what I need to do to solve it and kind of coming up with the approach for like how to tackle this thing. And I've had so many stories. I have so many stories and so many moments like that kind of fill me with a sense of pride and warmth. And like, those are things that I get that are gratifying to me.
So we do hear this often. It's solving of the difficult problems that gives the most joy and pride to people. Talking about a lot of your experience in this industry, what for you is the ultimate end goal? What would you be able to look back and say, I was proud in what I did?
The truth is, like, a lot of times people ask the question, like, where do you see yourself in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, And while it's important to have long-term goals, it's also important to have like more realistic bite-sized goals. And, like, who knows, in 30 years from now, maybe I'll be the CEO of my own aerospace company. Maybe I'll be doing something completely unrelated to aerospace at all, and that's fine as long as I'm getting enjoyment out of it. And as long as I'm feel like I'm contributing to society. And so that's kind of my goal. For short term, my goal is to keep learning and keep growing as an engineer, keep expanding my skill set and make myself as useful as I could possibly be. So that's kind of where I'm at right now, where my head's at, especially like starting a new job where I'm going to be learning new skills, kind of focusing more on those bite-sized goals for right now. But as far as the end goal is concerned, moon is not even the moon is the limit.
That's awesome. So you obviously have, a big source of motivation in helping others achieve their goals, helping others achieve very difficult problems or achieve solutions to very difficult problems. What is some advice you'd give to maybe an aerospace engineer in their second year of school to get to where you are?
Good question. I've got a few sage words of advice that I think would be appropriate here. The first one, and none of this applies to just aerospace engineering, it just applies to everybody in general. But the first one that I think is the most important is take ownership of your stuff. And stuff that's not your stuff. What I mean by that is when you say you're going to do something, or if you see something that needs to be done, just do it and take responsibility and take ownership of the issue. Sometimes it's scary to see a problem and take ownership of it without knowing how you're going to solve it. But the truth is that the way that you can earn respect from the people around you, and the way that you can help yourself the most is by taking ownership and taking responsibility of the problem and seeing it through. Think about all the outcomes, think about the different problems you're going to face and address them. But and this kind of theme of ownership is something that's across all industries. And it's, I actually haven't read it. It's on my list. But one book that was recommended to me by a peer of mine is called Extreme Ownership. And it's, you guys are nodding like you've heard of it.
Jocko Willink.
Yep. So, the idea there is like you are in control of yourself and your surroundings, and you take responsibility and take ownership of the things that are in your control. And that's going to help you out so much as you start your career. And it's also going to enable you to learn the most. So that's kind of the first, I guess, big one. Another couple really appropriate pieces of advice in this time post-pandemic with regards to working remotely and working from home is there's kind of like a weird balance here. And I think that working remotely and working from home is like really valuable. It gives you so much flexibility and allows you to do so many cool things. Like I could go home, visit my family and work remote. But I think that if you're working remotely 100%, a lot of times you might be selling yourself short in terms of setting up for opportunities. I think that interactions and engagement with your peers is so important, and you lose out on a lot of that when you're just doing it over Zoom or webcam. So that's kind of one more piece of advice that I recommend is like, if you're earlier in your career, be hesitant to accept a fully 100% remote position if you think that it might hinder your career progression because of the relationships and interactions that you form. I think that at our stage, at our ages, like relationships are so important, and I would not be where I am today if I didn't have relationships that I've made along the way. So that's kind of another big one.
Love that. To wrap up, we always like to ask all of our guests, through your time in the industry or your time in university or your time in school, your childhood, whatever it may be, what is that no fear moment that you often look back at and think, I got through that, I can get through anything else?
Oh, yeah. A good no fear moment that I can think of with related to work is we were wrapping up this huge build project, and the lead engineer on my team left the company. I had to wear a bunch of different hats and step up and kind of really buckle down and, suffer for a couple months in order to get this done. But, I took ownership. I saw the opportunity here for advancement and making a name for myself, and I took it. And it ended up being tough, but, got through it, got a promotion out of it to backfill that lead engineer position. And if I hadn't done that, I don't think that I would be in the position I am today, where I'm taking on a new great job, and I am coming from a title of lead engineer, and have a lot of the respect and appreciation from my peers at work, and leaving on such a good note. So I think that's a good no fear moment.
That's awesome, Harry. And I really have enjoyed this conversation with you. And this has really brought me to one last question. You obviously solve a ton of hard problems. I've never spoken with someone that makes being an instrumentation engineer at a aerospace industry company sounds so easy. But I also know you've taken up golf recently. What's harder, rocket science or golf?
Golf.
Awesome stuff, Harry. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, and I hope we can do this again soon.
Me too. I think I still have time to go hit the driving range, so.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of the No Fear podcast, brought to you by House & Hughes. For more information about our show, visit thenofearpodcast.com. If you enjoy this podcast, be sure to subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. You can also connect with us on LinkedIn, Instagram, Twitter, or TikTok for insights into future episodes.